What's the hardest family conversation you've never had?
They told me they could not take us both, said it like a favor, and then, with the breezy confidence of people who assume I will smooth it over, they picked my sister for the Mediterranean getaway because she is, in my mother's words, more fun. Code for you handle messes, you ask questions, you do not fit the scrapbook. I smiled the fixer's smile, said work was busy, offered to water the plants and forward the mail and drive them to the airport. While I tried not to flinch at the math that I've been funding their comfort for years and still came in second place to the person who forgets due dates and laughs about it. If you think this is jealousy over a vacation, then you have not lived in a home where gratitude spoils fast, because that sentence, "we cannot take you both," was only the bow on a long box of smaller cuts. The holiday checks that slid my way because I have the steady job, the car payment that landed on my card because theirs was complicated, the rent deposit I fronted so no one would be embarrassed, followed by jokes about me being the serious one who loves spreadsheets. I will not pretend I did not volunteer, because I did, telling myself it was love and that love looks like showing up with money when timing is bad, until my mother added that bringing me would be stressful because I make schedules and ask questions, which translated neatly to "you are useful until you are visible," and once I heard it that clearly, I could not unhear it. After the airport drop-off, the quiet did not feel like loneliness. It felt like a clean counter where I could finally set down the thought I had been avoiding, that I have been subsidizing people who do not include me when it is time to enjoy the spoils. So I opened my laptop and looked at the ledger of our family. There were the rent advances and the co-pays and the surprise flights and the holiday splurges that always seemed to find my card. Not because anyone forced me, but because I made it easy, and seeing it in a row made something in me click into place. The sound of a door that should have been closed years ago. Here is the unglamorous truth about being dependable. You have access, and access turns into leverage the minute you stop pretending it is love. So I mapped every place my name sat next to theirs, every auto-pay born in a crisis and never retired. Every shared login kept out of habit, and I began peeling my name back like a sticker that was never meant to be permanent. While their first photos hit the family chat with captions about finally taking time for themselves, I opened drawers and the closet in my old room, packed slowly and decisively, set the spare key on the counter like a small metal period at the end of a long run-on sentence, and felt a quiet strength build where panic used to live. Do not confuse this with cruelty. It was fairness with a spine, and if fairness felt sharp, it was because they had grown used to leaning on the softest part of me like furniture. And when people call you sturdy long enough, they forget that sturdy is not the same as available. They told me they could not take us both and chose my sister for the getaway I had indirectly funded, and while they toasted the start of their adventure, I quietly started mine, because when they come home the room will not hold me and the accounts will not hold them. And that is the hook you need to understand what happens next. When the house settled into the kind of silence that follows a departure where no one bothered to ask if you wanted to come along, I sat at the table and forced myself to look at the truth I had been postponing for years, which was that my role in this family had never been to belong but to bankroll, to smooth, to fix, to patch holes with my own paycheck while they carried on as if generosity were my natural setting and gratitude some optional afterthought. I pulled out the stack of papers where my handwriting lived beside theirs, the leases and the emergency passwords and the autopay forms signed in my neat script, because no one else could pass a credit check. And I studied them not like mementos of love but as evidence in a trial, and what stared back at me was the simple, brutal pattern of a daughter who said yes too often and a family who learned quickly that yes was cheaper than effort. And as long as I kept saying it, there would be no reason for them to stop asking. The first vacation photo popped onto my phone, one of those group selfies where everyone leans close and grins about finally taking time for themselves, and I felt the reflex pull at me. The urge to send back a heart and a joke and to make it easy for them to feel good about leaving me behind, but instead I flipped the phone face down and opened every account I had ever touched on their behalf, every utility that still carried my card, every subscription that quietly rolled into my lap during a crisis, every shared plan that had long since become indistinguishable from my own life, and I started pulling myself out piece by piece. I did not drain their money, because that was never mine to touch, but I cut off the lifelines they had mistaken for permanent pipelines, removed my card from the gas and the phone plan and the internet, canceled autopays that were born from emergencies years ago and had somehow never ended, and as I pressed confirm after confirm, I felt the strangest kind of relief. The kind that comes when you realize that half your exhaustion has been manufactured by the simple fact that you kept making other people's bills your own responsibility, and then telling yourself it was love. Scrolling deeper, I found reminders of how invisible my giving had become, like the apartment deposit I had put down for my sister when she needed a cosigner. Money that should have come back to me when the lease ended, but somehow just dissolved into her new life without a word. And instead of swallowing the familiar irritation, I wrote to the management office with a professional tone, attached the receipt with my name on it, and requested that the refund be returned directly to me, not out of spite, but out of the overdue recognition that fairness does not have to ask permission. I redirected my mail to a box only I could open, changed the recovery emails on accounts that no longer served me, shut down the streaming profiles that had been treated as communal property under my name, and lined up cancellation dates to coincide with their return flight, not to strand them mid-vacation, but to place the full weight of their lives back into their own hands the moment they stepped off the plane, because boundaries do not need fireworks to matter. They just need to exist. Without apology. Of course, I cried, because it is not simple to face the humiliation of realizing you wrote the training manual for how others misuse you. And I let the tears come not for missing them or for the vacation that excluded me, but for the years I spent mistaking my silence for maturity, and once they passed I felt something like clarity slip in. The kind that makes even ordinary actions feel like part of a larger design. The second photo arrived, this one captioned with a jab about me needing to loosen up, and instead of shrinking I drafted a message to my mother where I told her that I love them, but I am done financing their choices, that every shared account tied to me has been closed, that deposits and credits with my name will come back to me, and that if we need to talk we can do it with receipts in hand, and I scheduled the message to send at sunrise on the morning they come home so it would land like a key waiting on the counter of an empty room. And when it was all queued and ready and my old room stood half cleared of everything I was not willing to leave behind again, I pressed confirm on the final transfer that would return the deposit to my account the day before their flight landed. Not to punish, but to balance the math, and as the confirmation appeared on the screen I knew the next sound I would hear from them would not be cheerful vacation stories, but the stunned silence that comes when people realize the person they mistook for a bottomless wallet has finally, decisively, walked away. By the third night of their trip, while their posts still poured in with captions about sunsets and seafood and once-in-a-lifetime views, I was sitting cross-legged on the floor of my room surrounded by half-filled boxes, not panicking the way I once would have, but moving slowly and deliberately as if every folded sweater and packed binder was another piece of evidence that I was finally done playing the part they had written for me without asking, and the strange thing was that instead of sadness, what filled me was a kind of calm that felt earned, like breathing air after months of holding my lungs half empty because no one ever gave me permission to exhale. I began with the documents, because papers do not lie, and stacked them into folders that bore my name alone, not my parents' initials or my sister's scribbles, and as I sifted through leases, medical bills, old tuition payments, and joint accounts that had lived too long under my responsibility, I kept hearing my mother's voice saying that I had always been the reliable one, the one who could handle details, the one who could be trusted, which had once sounded like praise but now landed in my ears like a confession that they had quietly decided I was more useful as an asset than as a daughter. After the files came the electronics, the devices I had linked and financed, the laptops I had set up with my own credit card to save them from late fees, the phones that had once been family gifts but were still routed through my name. And I deactivated what was mine and left what was theirs without the cushion of my coverage, because part of growing up, I realized, was letting other people grow up too, even if it meant they stumbled when the training wheels they thought were permanent suddenly disappeared. Then I walked through my room and looked at the things I had left behind over the years, pieces of my life that had been ignored in the corner because I had been too busy paying for their wants to notice my own, and I packed them methodically. Not like a thief in the night, but like a woman reclaiming what was hers, and with every box taped shut, I felt a weight slide off my shoulders, the kind of weight you only realize you are carrying when it's finally gone. Once the physical clearing was underway, I turned back to the digital world, because power these days lives less in what you can hold and more in what you can access, and I went through every shared password and account, every family login that they had treated as communal, and I changed them, not out of spite, but out of a renewed clarity that my generosity had been mistaken for obligation, and that nothing obligates me to subsidize people who think of me only when they need a deposit covered, or a balance paid. It was around midnight when I logged into the bank and froze the joint savings account that had quietly grown under my steady transfers, an account that was always for emergencies, but somehow seemed to fund more of their conveniences than my security. And as my finger hovered over the confirmation button, I thought about how many times I had skipped vacations of my own because I was told we all needed to tighten belts, only to watch them book trips for themselves, and in that moment the decision felt less like revenge and more like common sense finally catching up to me. The following morning, instead of going to work early like I usually did, I spent the day at a storage unit I had rented under my name alone, unloading boxes and furniture, creating a space that was mine not because anyone granted me permission, but because I signed the lease and paid the fee, and by the time I slid the lock into place I realized I had given myself something my family never had, which was independence without strings. When evening came, I returned to the house and stood in the doorway of my now bare room, looking at the empty shelves and stripped bed frame. And I imagined their faces when they returned and realized that the daughter they had left behind to manage plants and bills had not been waiting in place like a forgotten coat on a hook, but had instead walked out entirely, carrying not just her belongings, but the quiet authority of someone who had finally learned the difference between helping and being used. I sat on the floor one last time, phone in hand, drafting a message scheduled to send the day of their return, a message not filled with anger or theatrics, but with plain, undeniable truth, that I had closed every account tied to me, removed every automatic payment, reclaimed every deposit, and taken back every part of my life that had been siphoned off in the name of family duty, and that going forward, if they wanted to live the way they had grown used to, they would have to finance it themselves. And as I hit schedule and placed the key on the counter downstairs, I thought about how they would be raising champagne glasses at that very moment, laughing at a punchline that did not include me. While back home the foundations of their comfort were being carefully and systematically dismantled, and the satisfaction that filled me was not loud or flashy, but steady and undeniable, because this was not just the setup for payback. It was the first time in years that my life felt like it was mine. Again. When they finally returned, dragging their overstuffed luggage through the front door and calling out in the same cheerful tone they always used after a trip, they expected to be met with the usual chorus of welcome, the smell of a home that had been maintained for them, and the comfort of knowing everything was exactly as they had left it. Yet instead what greeted them was silence, a silence so absolute that it must have felt wrong even before they noticed the details, the missing items, the glaring emptiness where my life had once quietly sat in place, as if waiting for their approval to exist. At first, my mother laughed nervously, the way she always did when she felt a tension she did not want to acknowledge, brushing off the strangeness of the bare shelves in my room as if perhaps I had gone on some sudden cleaning spree. And my father muttered something about me being dramatic, certain that any sign of absence was temporary. But as they opened closets and drawers, as they stared at the stripped mattress and the dust outlines where boxes had once stood, that laughter dissolved into sharp questions, and the certainty that I was still the steady one began to crumble beneath the weight of what they were actually seeing. My sister, already glowing from the trip that had been all about her, tossed her bag on the couch and called out my name in a sing-song tone, expecting me to appear with the patience and forced smile that had so often softened her arrogance. But when no answer came, she stomped toward my room, pulled open the door, and froze, her voice catching in her throat as the realization hit that my things were not misplaced or rearranged, but gone, methodically packed and carried away, leaving nothing but The clear message that I had not simply stepped out but had removed myself completely. The panic began in whispers, my mother asking if maybe I had taken a short trip of my own, my father insisting that I would never do anything so rash, my sister rolling her eyes and declaring that I was just being petty. Yet all three of them moved through the house with growing urgency, searching for signs of me the way someone searches for a missing key they are sure they only misplaced, until the moment they sat down in the kitchen, opened their phones, and tried to access the bank accounts, only to be met with error messages and unfamiliar notifications, and the silence that followed was louder than any shouting could have been. My father's voice broke first, rising in disbelief as he refreshed the page over and over, muttering about mistakes and technical errors, while my mother clutched her phone tightly, scrolling through her apps as if a different result might appear if she just pressed hard enough, and my sister paced the room furiously, snapping about how I had no right, how everything would be fixed once I came to my senses. But beneath the noise was the undeniable truth, the accounts they had once leaned on so casually, the steady stream of funds that had supported vacations, bills, and comforts, were no longer theirs to assume, because I had cut the ties they thought were unbreakable. The calls started immediately, one after another, ringing through the quiet house like alarms, and I let them come, watching from the distance of my own apartment as their numbers lit up my phone. Each voicemail shifting in tone from confusion to anger to desperation, my mother begging me to explain, my father demanding that I undo whatever I had done, my sister shrieking about betrayal, but none of them saying the one word that mattered. The one word that had been absent for years: sorry. It was almost surreal to realize that for all the lectures I had absorbed about family loyalty, about sacrifices being a form of love, about the importance of sticking together, what they could not fathom was the possibility that I had finally chosen to stick with myself, that I had reached the conclusion that love without respect is not love at all but exploitation dressed in familiar language, and that I had stepped away not out of malice, but out of a decision that had been waiting far too long to be made. And so, as they sat surrounded by luggage full of souvenirs and clothes bought with money that, one way or another, had passed through my hands, they confronted not just the emptiness of my room, but the emptiness of their own assumptions. Because I was no longer there to buffer them from reality, and the life they had built on my compliance had collapsed in a single week, not with fireworks or screaming matches, but with the quiet, deliberate withdrawal of everything they had once taken for granted. When I finally picked up one of their calls, letting their voices crash through the speaker like a storm, I did not shout. I did not defend myself. I did not offer excuses. I simply listened until they ran out of anger, until their demands melted into silence, and then, with the kind of calm that only comes when you have already made peace with your choice, I told them a single sentence that shifted the power forever, that I was done being their safety net, that from now on, if they wanted a life of comfort, they would have to pay for it themselves. The line went silent, and for the first time in years, I was not the one waiting nervously for their reaction. I was the one who had finally delivered mine, and it was not just a message, it was a reckoning. A mirror held up to the people who had thought I would never dare to let go, and as they scrambled to process what had happened, I sat back and realized that the shock they felt was not just about the missing belongings or the frozen accounts, but about the undeniable fact that I had stopped playing the role they had written for me, and the story they thought they controlled was no longer theirs to tell. When I finally agreed to meet them face to face, it was not because I wanted reconciliation or because I had second thoughts about the choices I had made, but because I knew that closure sometimes requires being in the same room. And I wanted to see their expressions when I laid out, in undeniable detail, how years of quiet exploitation had finally reached their limit, so I walked into that kitchen. The same one where I had spent countless holidays cooking meals I paid for and cleaning up after. Celebrations I had bankrolled, and this time I sat down with no apron, no smile, no sense of obligation, only the clarity of someone who has nothing left to lose. My mother spoke first, her voice brittle, heavy with the kind of false softness she always used when she wanted something from me, telling me they were confused, that they never meant to hurt me, that family sometimes makes mistakes. and that we could fix all of this if I would just reverse what I had done. But instead of nodding along as I might have before, I leaned forward and reminded her of the times I had been the one to fix things. The time I paid their mortgage to avoid foreclosure. The time I spent my bonus covering a medical bill no one thanked me for. The vacations I declined so they could afford their own. The countless weekends where I sat at this very table balancing ledgers for everyone but myself. And I asked her plainly if any of those sacrifices had ever been acknowledged as more than "that's what you're good at." My father shifted uncomfortably, his instinct to bluster rising to the surface, telling me that money was just money and that family should not keep score. But I cut him off with the simple truth that family had been keeping score all along. Only they had kept it in their favor, assigning me the role of provider while assigning my sister the role of recipient, and then acting as if my resentment was immaturity rather than the natural result of years of being dismissed whenever I asked for fairness. My sister, who had been glaring from the moment I arrived, finally exploded, accusing me of being jealous, of ruining everything because I could not handle being left out of one trip. And I turned to her and asked how many trips had been funded indirectly by my work, how many gifts and comforts had passed through my accounts, how many doors had been opened for her because I was the one willing to sign on dotted lines she would never have qualified for, and when she sputtered that she had not asked for my help, I reminded her that not asking is not the same as refusing, and that silence in the face of generosity is still complicity when the benefits keep rolling in. The room grew quiet then, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than shouting, and into that silence I delivered the words I had rehearsed not because I needed them to be sharp, but because I needed them to be true. I told them I was finished being their safety net, that every account tied to me was closed, that every deposit I had once floated would be reclaimed, and that I was no longer the daughter who silently filled in the cracks while being treated like an afterthought when it came time to celebrate. They tried bargaining then, my mother pleading about family bonds, my father insisting they had only ever done what they thought was best, my sister scoffing that I would come crawling back once I realized how much I needed them. But I shook my head and told them the part that made all the difference, which was that I did not need them. I never had. It had always been the other way around, and the only reason they were in shock now was because they had confused my willingness to give with their right to take. I stood up, slid my chair back, and let the weight of my words linger in the space they used to control so easily, and before I left I told them something I had never dared to say aloud, that love without respect is just manipulation, and that I loved myself enough now to walk away even if they never understood why, because their understanding was no longer the currency I lived by. When I walked out of that house, the air felt different, not lighter in a poetic sense, but simply freer, like I had taken off a coat I did not realize had been suffocating me, and I knew that while they would spend the coming weeks scrambling, blaming, rewriting the story to make themselves victims of my so-called cruelty, I had no need to defend myself anymore, because the truth was written in their empty accounts, in the stripped room upstairs, and in the absence of the daughter who had finally stopped mistaking sacrifice for belonging. And as I closed the door behind me, I thought of the sentence that would stay with them long after the shouting faded, the one that had ended the cycle and begun something new. They chose her, and this time, I chose me, and for the first time in years, the choice felt like victory.